Everybody, this is Eric Saviano with Enroll Nebraska. I want to welcome you to our webinar today that is going to cover immigrant eligibility for the Affordable Care Act and Nebraska Medicaid and CHIP. We're excited to be talking to you all. Enroll Nebraska is working hard to get more and more enrollments in the Affordable Care Act and through Medicaid. And we need partners to do that, just like you. So we appreciate your presence today, and hour of information and some questions and answers at the end. So once again, my name is Eric Saviano, and I am with Enroll Nebraska as the statewide coordinator. Enroll Nebraska is a coalition led by Nebraska Appleseed. And we work closely together, and often we present on these webinars together. So we look forward to that as well. Today, we are going to talk about immigrant eligibility for Medicaid in the marketplace. Webinar materials can be found at enrollnebraska.org/EEG. And the EEG stands for Education and Engagement Group. And that's what we call this group where we do the webinars. We're going to cover general eligibility and the immigrant population for both Medicaid and Marketplace. And then we hope that we can equip you as advocates and as assisters to go out and spread the word about some of this and get it in the hands of people who need it, hopefully resulting in more people getting enrolled in the end. So we do have time for questions and answers but there's a defined time at the end of the webinar. We open it up, as always, to chats. Feel free to put your questions in the chat box on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. You can chat to us at any time, and we do our best to get as quick as we can. Before we get into our main agenda, I do like to go over some of the specifics of Enroll Nebraska. Some of you have heard this before, but let's give it a shot. So we have been around for 4 years now. We are a statewide network of community organizations, enrollment assisters, healthcare advocates, and providers. We are doing our best to organize the enrollment assister community, the people who get paid to offer free and unbiased advice to individuals enrolling in healthcare through the Affordable Care Act and Medicaid. We convene that group, we try to motivate that group, and we do our best to get more people enrolled. One main resource you should know about is enrollnebraska.org and our Facebook and Twitter accounts. They have good information, current information, and we'll stay up to date as things likely will change in the near future and as they change generally. So we have blogs there, we have resources like enrollment assister maps, where individuals can go on and find the closest person to them in the state who can help them get assistance for free. And also an events calendar where you can find events that are happening near you as well. So again, this group is our effort to get more community partners, schools, churches, other agencies in the know about the Affordable Care Act and Medicaid. We rely on you all to get the word out and be our referral system to get more people enrolled who are in your networks. It takes a trusted friend, a trusted organization to get in most people's. A good way of saying it is to get people's trust, you have to know them. And so we are trying to expand our networks and get more people enrolled by engaging you all. Webinars occur every month, and they're archived at the same website where the materials are found, enrollnebraska.org/EEG. And I always like to end it with, we think of this as a low time investment for you who might be pursuing other interests, or nonprofits who are interested in doing other things, helping other ways. This is a high impact because healthcare can be the changing and deciding factor in someone's health and in financial situations as well, including bringing people out of poverty, avoiding medical debt, and avoiding bankruptcy and the like. Before we, again, we are going to just talk a little bit about open enrollment so far. These numbers were updated just today, or just at the end of the day yesterday. So I'm going to show you these, but also update them with the new numbers. So we are currently at a national number of around 4 million, which is great. About 4,100. Sorry, 4,100,000. If that's the way you say it. And that's nationally. In Nebraska, we're almost at 45,000 enrolled. This 23,000 was at 4 weeks, and we're now at 6 weeks. As of 12/10, December 10th, we are at 45,000, and that is up about 2% above last year this time. A great stat is that the day after the election, when things did not quite go the way many expected, and lots of those around the Affordable Care Act, over 100,000 people enrolled the day after the election. So people were excited to get coverage, a strong demand for this product, and more people are enrolling. So 100,000 was the most that had enrolled up to that point, and more people are getting enrolled before today, the final deadline, or the coverage that starts January 1st. While we're on this topic of uncertainty, all right, it looks like we're having an issue with sound. Is everybody hearing me pretty well otherwise? All right, so we're still checking out some audio issues. I know this happens every so often with us, but looks like a couple people are hearing loud and clear. So Deborah and anyone else who's having problems, if you would, try reloading, try shutting down any other apps that are taking up bandwidth or kicking people off Netflix next to you. Okay, so back to the presentation. Story collection, we have kicked off, and a lot of national groups have done as well. Web page that is collecting enrollment stories, so positive Affordable Care Act stories that is open to you and anyone in your network. Located on our website at enrollnebraska.org/share. And we also have on the Enroll Nebraska website these postcards that can be printed on 11 by 17, not 11 by 17, 8.5 by 11, and can be distributed or posted around your office. It's in English and Spanish, and we'd love to hear from folks who have gotten coverage through the Affordable Care Act and talk about next steps with those. That's one way that we are working to ensure that we have the Affordable Care Act going forward, and really showing the value of this product and how it is affecting people's lives in Nebraska. Our delegation needs to hear that, and we are helping that effort with this story collection. So, with that, I'm going to turn it over to our staff attorney at Nebraska Appleseed in the Healthcare Access Program, who's going to talk through the immigrant eligibility. And again, if you have questions, feel free to post them in the chat box. Get to them as we see them or at the end of the presentation. All right, so I'll hand it over to Molly.
Hi, everybody. As Eric mentioned, my name is Molly McCleary. I'm the staff attorney here at Appleseed in our Healthcare Access Program. And today we're going to be tackling immigrant eligibility for Medicaid in the marketplace, and a pretty extensive topic. We could probably do several webinars on it, but we'll try to give a broad overview and have some time for questions at the end.
Let me also mention that on the enrollnebraska.org/EEG, under this meeting, there are meeting materials which include 2 one-pagers in English and Spanish about Medicaid and marketplace eligibility that you can reference quickly while we go through this.
Great. So just a couple disclaimers before we get started. As I mentioned, the intent of this is to give a general overview around the rules for immigrant eligibility. As we'll work through this, you'll realize this is a super complicated topic. It's a topic where there are rules and then exceptions to the exception. So we'll try to go through it slowly, but please feel free to add questions in the chat box and we'll try to answer them. If you have a question about someone's very specific immigration situation or their eligibility, it's best to talk to their sister or work through the process with them. It's hard to answer these types of questions in a general way without all of the relevant information about a person's situation and their particular visa or situation. So just keep that in mind. Lastly, if you are worried that applying for insurance or making a statement about person's immigration status could or make things difficult for them in the immigration context, please consult an immigration attorney. This isn't meant to serve as legal advice for immigration-related issues. I will mention some of the rules around what information can be disclosed by the marketplace at the end. And so I think that will address some of those concerns, but when in doubt, talk to an immigration attorney. Okay, let's dive into Medicaid. These are sort of the general Medicaid requirements. These are the requirements that citizen, non-citizen has to meet to be eligible for Medicaid. So in order to be eligible, a person must have a low income and a low number of assets. The reason I have an asterisk next to that is that for income, it varies based on the different categories, and we'll talk about categories in a second. And then some categories have asset tests and some don't. So depending on what category you fit in, you might have to prove up assets. Some do not have to do that. The income varies based on category. That means depending on if you're a child or a senior or one of the other categories, the amount of money that you can earn and still be eligible for Medicaid is different. And we'll get to those in more detail in a second, but that's what that means. You have to have an eligible immigration status, which we will also talk about in more detail. You have to be a Nebraska resident, which means that the person must be living in Nebraska and have the intent to remain permanently for an indefinite period. Everybody who applies for Medicaid should have the opportunity to establish that you're a state resident. If you are in the state temporarily on a temporary visa, you are not a resident of the state. You're here on a student visa where you have to say, I will leave at the end of, you can't prove that you intend to remain in the state and intend to leave at the same time. So that's something to keep in mind. And then you have to fit into one of the categories that I mentioned. So you have to be a child, you have to be a senior, which is 65 or older, you have to be blind or disabled, you have to be a pregnant woman, or be a very, very low income parent. As you can see from this, there are some groups that are left out regardless of their income. These would be childless adults who don't have a disability or are not a senior. They would not be in these categories. And then some very low income parents who make more money than the Medicaid threshold would also be ineligible. Let's walk through each of these eligibility requirements in more detail. So as I mentioned, the amount of money a person can earn and be eligible for Medicaid category in which they fall. So it depends on whether they're a child or a pregnant woman or which category they fit into based on their personal characteristics. As you can see, these vary based on a range. So parents, low-income parents, can earn the least amount of money and be eligible for Medicaid at 58% of the federal poverty level. And then children and persons with disabilities are higher at over 200% and some up to 250%. It's important to note that the rules around disability and income are very complicated. And so the income is reflected by a range between 100 and 250%. It varies depending on a person's circumstances. All right, so now that we've talked about income and residency, we have to talk about qualified immigration statuses. This is where it starts to get tricky. To be eligible for Medicaid, you have to have an eligible immigration status. This goes back to these definitions that came around in the 90s around what is considered a qualified alien or qualified non-citizen. A person has to fit into these categories of being a qualified alien or qualified non-citizen. A person's immigration status dictates whether they fit into those categories. On the slide is a list of some of the qualified alien or qualified non-citizen categories. It's not all of them, but these are sort of the ones that are more commonly encountered. The ones I'll note for sure are green card holders, refugees and asylees, and then persons granted withholding of deportation or removal are the ones that we sort of encounter the most. This is one of the sort of exceptions to an exception kind of things, is that trafficking victims, so people here in the US on a visa based on being a trafficking victim, are not considered qualified aliens or qualified non-citizens, but they are treated in the same way that a qualified alien or qualified non-citizen would be treated. So they are sort of treated specially because of the circumstances. If you meet these qualifications, you're considered a qualified alien, so you have an eligible immigration status. However, some qualified immigrants must wait 5 years before they are eligible for Medicaid. This is if someone entered the US after 1996, they may encounter what is known as the 5-year bar or the 5-year ban. So for example, Lewis enters the US on a U visa in 2011 and gets a green card in 2012. Because of the 5-year bar, even though he's a qualified immigrant and lawfully present in the US, he can't get Medicaid until 2017 after that 5-year period. There are some exceptions to the 5-year bar, and we'll walk through a handful of those in more detail. But some people have a qualified immigration status. They would normally be subject to the 5-year bar, but they fall into an exception, and so they don't have this 5-year bar. These are refugees, asylees, lawful permanent residents who used to be refugees or asylees, veterans, active duty military and their family, certain trafficking victims, lawfully residing pregnant women and children, which is the ACA category. We'll do quite a bit more on that. Emergency Medicaid, or EMSA is it's called in Nebraska, and then 599 CHIP. So we have a question. On the 5-year bar, do they qualify on year 5 or start qualifying status on year 6? So it's 5, you have to be lawfully present for 5 full years. So I guess it would be at the beginning of year 6, if that makes sense. So on the example, you enter the US in 2011, you get your green card in 2012. So say you got your green card on January 1st, 2012. You would have to be here 2012, 13, 14, 15, 16. January 1st, 2017 would be the first day you would be eligible for Medicaid. So just to walk back through before we start jumping into some of these more exception-y categories. To be eligible for Medicaid, you have to have a low income or assets. That depends on what sort of characteristics you have, what personal characteristics you have, and what category you fall into, like child or pregnant woman. You have to have an eligible immigration status, which is what we're talking about now. You have to be a Nebraska resident, which is somewhat related to your immigration status, depending on if you have a temporary visa or a more permanent status. And you have to fit into one of the categories, like being a child, a senior, pregnant woman, or others. So where this gets really complicated is what we're talking about now, and that's the qualified immigration status. So you have to be a qualified alien. That's that list of statuses that we talked about. Some qualified aliens will be subject to this 5-year bar. There are exceptions to that 5-year bar for specific situations. We'll go into what those specific situations are. So this is what I was talking about with there being an exception, but then there's an exception to an exception. So I am not a person who can hear these things verbally and understand this. So I made a little chart. So I hope this is helpful. So I like to think about this. If you are going through the Medicaid application process, this is sort of how it works. So you'd have to meet on the far left of your screen Medicaid eligibility requirements that everybody has to meet. So you have to have the income requirements, fall into a certain category, etc. Then you have to have a qualified immigration, within those categories, a qualified immigration status, and potentially be subject to the 5-year bar. However, there are exceptions or special categories of coverage that are not subject to the 5-year bar. These are what we just talked about, which are refugees and asylees, military and veterans, certain trafficking victims, and then ACA, emergency Medicaid or EMSA, and 599 CHIP, which is what we'll talk about now. So ACA is the Legal Immigrant Children's Health Improvement Act. That's what that stands for. This was an option that our state took up where some lawfully residing pregnant women and children are exempt from the 5-year bar if they meet certain requirements. So you have to be a lawfully residing person, which means you have to be a qualified alien, so fit into that list of categories that I mentioned. You haven't violated the terms of your status, and you have to be an immigrant child or pregnant woman, otherwise meet the eligibility for Medicaid. So you have to have the income and meet all those other sort of general Medicaid eligibility requirements, be lawfully present in the US, and be a Nebraska resident. If you meet those qualifications and you're within that 5-year bar, you aren't subject to the 5-year bar. So that's one of the exceptions. It's important to note that DACA individuals and undocumented immigrants can't fall within this exception. They can't be enrolled in Medicaid or CHIP through ACA, even though DACA recipients are technically lawfully present. They are unable to meet that. And undocumented immigrants aren't technically lawfully present, so they couldn't be enrolled through Medicaid or CHIP through this option. What this exception really means in practice is that pregnant women and children get coverage without waiting 5 years after their arrival. So pregnant women can get coverage specifically during their pregnancy and 60 days postpartum. So they get the pregnancy-related coverage. Children can get coverage, the child coverage, and could continue to receive that coverage until they reach the age of majority, which in Nebraska is age 19. So that's an important exception to know that sometimes, even though you might think you're subject to the 5-year bar, depending on your circumstances, you may be eligible for that exception. A special coverage category is 599 CHIP. So 599 CHIP is coverage for women who are ineligible for Medicaid as a result of their immigration status, they can apply for coverage for their unborn child. Because the unborn child is receiving the coverage and not the mother, and the unborn child is a U.S. citizen, an undocumented mother could get prenatal coverage. I'll say that again, the coverage is going to the child and not the mother. So that's where what this all sort of hangs on. A mother has to apply and be denied regular Medicaid first. She must have an income below the pregnancy threshold, which is 194% of the federal poverty level, and be a Nebraska resident. An undocumented person can technically, even though they're not lawfully present, be a Nebraska resident because they have that intent to remain indefinitely. After applying and being deemed eligible, the duration of coverage for 599 CHIP is prenatal care, labor and delivery, and the baby's hospital costs. At that point, the mother could apply for Medicaid or CHIP for her child, her U.S. citizen baby, to continue receiving coverage. However, the mother is unable to get postpartum care through 599 CHIP. So, and that makes sense if you think of it in terms of the coverage going to the baby and not the mother. That's why there's no postpartum care. So that's another special coverage category. The last special coverage category we'll talk about is emergency Medicaid, or what is called in Nebraska EMSA, and I think that's emergency Medicaid. Okay, yep. Serena mentioned with 599 CHIP, just as a reminder, it's not a qualified health plan because it doesn't cover all care. It's only coverage for conditions that impact or affect the pregnancy, and that's right. So it's not the full scope care that a person might get in other Medicaid circumstances. It's only that prenatal care and coverage impacting the pregnancy that you can receive. Very similar to what we'll see with emergency Medicaid. Emergency Medicaid is not full scope Medicaid coverage for undocumented or otherwise ineligible immigrants. So they meet the income, residency, and other standards, but due to their immigration status are not otherwise eligible for Medicaid. They're able to get coverage for emergency conditions. It's not continuous coverage or ongoing eligibility. It's only coverage for specific dates of an emergency. And you have to submit documentation of the nature of that emergency condition to the Department of Health and Human Services, and they determine the specific dates for which you're covered. There's also a specific determination of whether the issue that you're trying to receive coverage for is an emergency or not an emergency, and how long that might be. A cancer diagnosis, we have a question, would that be considered an emergency? My understanding, things like dialysis or cancer treatment or things like that are not considered an emergency, even though they can be life or death because it's an ongoing treatment situation. An emergency would be something like a heart attack and a car accident where you're rushed to the hospital and receive life-saving treatment at that moment. Something where you're getting, even though the result could be life or death, it's an ongoing treatment situation. It's not technically an emergency. But again, each sort of situation like that has to be determined, and the length or the scope of the coverage has to be determined by the Department of Health and Human Services. All right, so since you're all Medicaid experts now, we'll go to Marketplace, which has a bit different rules for eligibility for immigrants than Medicaid eligibility. Income eligibility for the Marketplace and subsidies is generally between 100 and 400% of the federal poverty level. To be eligible for Marketplace coverage, a person has to have a specific status or be an applicant for a specific status, or have a specific status plus an employment authorization. And we'll talk about that in more detail. So people with these statuses and others, which are listed on healthcare.gov, you can get the full list, are eligible to enroll in marketplace coverage. So if you're a lawful permanent resident or you have a green card, you're an asylee, you have certain non-immigrant statuses like work visas, so H1, H2A, H2B, student visas, U visas, T visas, temporary protected status. All of these are statuses with which you're eligible to enroll in marketplace coverage. This is where, when I said that broader in terms of eligibility than Medicaid, this is where this comes in. Because some of these non-immigrant statuses that I mentioned, like a student visa, able to form the intent of being a Nebraska resident, since it's a temporary status. So you wouldn't be able to be eligible for Medicaid in that way. You could still apply for marketplace coverage if you met the income requirements. Again, it's worth noting that deferred action statuses are generally eligible to enroll in marketplace coverage, except not DACA. So that is important to note. Again, this is just a list of some of the statuses that might come up more regularly, but again, there's a more full list on healthcare.gov. I spoke with some of the folks in our office who do work in immigrant communities and kind of asked which statuses they would see as being ones that be more likely to be of concern of folks on a webinar like this, and this is what they mentioned. So people with these statuses are eligible to enroll in marketplace coverage. People applying for these statuses are eligible to enroll. So you don't have to have the status yet, you could just be an applicant. An asylee, if you have an employment authorization, if you're an applicant for asylum plus employment authorization, or if you're an applicant for asylum under age 14 and you've had an application pending for at least 180 days, if you have temporary protected status with an employment authorization, if you're applying for special immigrant juvenile status, you're applying for a visa on the basis of being a trafficking victim, or if you're applying to adjust to LPR or lawful permanent resident status. Any of those applications are enough to have someone be eligible for marketplace coverage. Then there's a group of statuses for which, if you have that status plus employment authorization, you would be eligible. These would be things like registry applicants, applications for cancellation of deportation, or cancellation of removal or suspension of deportation, or applicant for legalization under the Immigrant Reform and Control Act. Again, these are not complete lists, either this applicant plus employment authorization or just the applicant list. So if you want the full list, if you're working with someone who has common status, that would be on healthcare.gov. Okay, so we've talked about sort of the eligibility to apply, but what does this mean in terms of subsidies? So just because you may be able to get enrolled in coverage, that doesn't necessarily mean you're eligible for subsidies. So like I mentioned, subsidies are available for folks between 100 and 400% of the federal poverty level. However, where this gets tricky in terms of whether you're eligible for subsidies is if you're below 100% of the federal poverty level. Because Nebraska is not an expansion state, we have this tricky situation where if your immigration status would make you eligible for Medicaid, but your subsidies or Medicaid below 100% because Nebraska hasn't expanded Medicaid. However, if you have prevent you from being eligible for Medicaid subsidies, but not Medicaid. Now, I realize this is super confusing. So I'll say it again a little bit differently. Where this rule is coming from is to create a system where, so this rule was written before Medicaid expansion became an option for states. So the thought was to create a system where immigrants eligible for Medicaid and immigrants ineligible for Medicaid would see similar treatment across Medicaid in the marketplace. Because Nebraska has not expanded Medicaid, we have a tricky situation where immigrants under 100% of the federal poverty level who have a status that would normally make them eligible for Medicaid. So all the stuff that we talked about at the beginning of the presentation. Because Nebraska hasn't expanded Medicaid, they can't get Medicaid. But also they can't get subsidies because the system was designed to be assuming they could get subsidies, or they could get Medicaid and not subsidies. Sorry. So there's a gap there for sure. If they have an immigration status that would make them ineligible for Medicaid, they can get subsidies, but not Medicaid. So if this doesn't make sense and seems illogical, in that we're sort of treating immigrants with ineligible immigration statuses better than those who would have an eligible immigration status, that is right. It's in a result that is purely because Medicaid expansion is an option. It was designed to kind of create, like I said, continuity and similar treatment, but now it is sort of flipped on its head because that option hasn't been taken up. I have a question. The asylum applicant under 14 years, is this for Marketplace or only your Medicaid also? That is specifically Marketplace, that applicant under 14, plus the pending application that was specifically for Marketplace. All right, so as I mentioned at the beginning, there might be issues with clients who are concerned about what the impact of applying for coverage, how does that impact their immigration status or adjustments to their status or things like that. It's not uncommon for folks in immigrant families to have different people with different statuses. So you might have a family where you have someone who is undocumented, a person who is a U.S. citizen, a person who has a visa, and things like that. So it's very, I would say, uncommon for everyone to have the same status. Undocumented immigrants are not eligible for Marketplace coverage or subsidies, but they can apply for family members who would be eligible or be part of a household with eligible members. So the undocumented immigrant themselves is not eligible for coverage or the subsidies, but other people in their family can be, and they can make that application on their behalf. So for example, Alex is undocumented. His daughter, Sophia, was born in the U.S. Born in Nebraska. She's a U.S. citizen. Alex can apply for Marketplace insurance and subsidies for Sophia and not himself. So he could, which makes sense. If you have a child, they're probably not capable of applying for insurance for themselves. So their parent can do that. Their parent, being undocumented, won't receive any subsidies for themselves, but could for their child. Family members who aren't applying for coverage will not be asked if they have an eligible immigration status. So in this situation, Alex is not applying for himself, so the Marketplace can't ask Alex what his immigration status is. The information provided on the Marketplace application will not be shared with immigration enforcement or used for that purpose. So that is something that people can take comfort in, knowing that they can apply for the members of their family that are eligible or that may be eligible, and not be asked questions that are irrelevant to that person, that eligible or potentially eligible person's application, and that information will only be used for health insurance purposes and not other purposes. And just to say that again, the marketplace can't make an applicant provide information about the citizenship status or immigration status of anyone in the family or the household who's not applying for coverage. So if they're not applying for coverage, that question can't be asked. So now that we have like whipped through a super complicated topic in 21 minutes, we will go through some resources that might be helpful for following up, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So as Eric mentioned, on the Enroll Nebraska website, so enrollnebraska.org/G, there are a couple helpful resources that we can provide. So there's one sheet, and this is available in both English and in Spanish, that covers the main points that I talked about in the Medicaid section. So Medicaid eligibility for immigrants, and it goes through the general categories. It goes through a list of statuses that might be eligible. So that is available online. And we also have one as well for marketplace information. There's also marketplace open enrollment information here with information about how to go to healthcare.gov or 211, and that's in English and in Spanish. And with that, I can answer any questions that folks might have, or I will try my best to do so.
Thanks, Molly. Well, once again, we have created these resources so that you can take them and hopefully get out into the community, post them places that you think they could be useful, and make use of them. They're all available for download. They're all easily adapted if you need them to be. We can change logos, make it your own, and feel free to just please ask if you have those needs. But once again, those one-pagers have been very useful whenever we make presentations on this, the Medicaid in English and Spanish, and then the marketplace in English and Spanish has been really well received. So once again, this last one as well, the open enrollment dates, is just a very general one-pager English, Spanish that can be useful in helping people make the first step in going to get their coverage. So any questions from the group? You have a minute to post those. Again, I think some of this might not lend itself too easily to a webinar format. It's almost, you have to reference it each time that you go and have one of these situations. But hopefully you can refer back to this webinar if you need to. It will be archived again. I think I've mentioned this at enrollnebraska.org/EEG. And that's it. I believe I haven't seen any additional questions. So before we leave you, I wanted to give you a quick positive infographic, let's say, something that is exciting to share at the end of a info-rich webinar. It is our partnership with 211. I think folks have known that for 2 years, we've had folks refer, call 211, which is the United Way's free referral hotline. They always, 24 hours a day, have people answering calls. It is kind of the counterpart to Enroll Nebraska's Assister map, and they can refer anybody anywhere in the state to the closest enrollment assister. And in the first month of open enrollment this year, they talked and told about 4,764 people that there is that they have someone close to them who can get health coverage, and of those people, lots of them were uninsured, about 600 of them, and about 29 of them asked for referrals, and that's where we referred them, down there in the bottom right-hand corner. So we really appreciate our partnership with United Way, and that's kind of fun to take a look at. So one question did come in the meantime. If a person with a non-immigrant status, such as a U visa, apply for marketplace subsidies, does that mean that they must have insurance to avoid the penalty, or can they choose not to apply for a marketplace and still avoid a penalty?
I'd have to double check. This is something that I've looked up before and it does not stick in my head, unfortunately. My gut instinct is no, but I want to double check. So let me do that and I will email you the answer to that.
Perfect. So since I'm not seeing any other questions, I'll let you know that our next and final webinar of Open Enrollment 4 is going to happen Thursday, January 19th. And it is our last push for open enrollment. We'll give a quick update about where we are numbers-wise, how close we are to last year's numbers, hopefully continuing the trend of being ahead of last year in the nation and in our state. And we'll talk more about next steps you can do to reach out to the folks in your network. So I want to thank everybody for being here. Have a great day, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.